What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership in focus. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Feel free to leak anything from the budget on here, Mr. Javid. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make the world work. We discuss everything from how the FTSE 100 is performing to the latest action being taken to combat global warming, and of course the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Sharon Birch, owner and manager of Footprints Learning for Life Nursery. Footprints is a nursery based in Hartlepool that focuses on providing every child with an equal opportunity for a great start in life, regardless of circumstances. Sharon founded Footprints in 2006 after a 20-year-long career in the police force. We discuss today the successes the nursery has had over the years, as well as the serious challenges they face in the coming year, as does the sector. Sharon, welcome.
Hi. Hello.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Sharon, I know we've got plenty to talk about, but I thought it might be a great place to start. I know it's been obviously a few months since yourselves at Footprints have been in the review. I think the listeners would love to know how you, the team, and the nursery are.
Yeah, well, we're going into a new phase. We've got lots of plans and ideas for 2020. We are looking to develop our services for developing individual practice for children's needs. We've got a few staff changes. We've got a few people coming back from maternity and people going off and going on to do other things. And I think it's a good time to look forward to the new year very positively.
Excellent. So a pretty exciting and what sounds like it could be a very hectic 2020 for you.
Definitely, yes, I think so.
It was never a bad thing, perhaps. But I think what a lot of people might not realise is that when Footprints was founded, you did that because of really very personal reasons. You were a mother of 3 children, and you realised how difficult it was to get a good, reliable childcare. But you come from a background in the police service, which isn't the traditional route. I think. How did you come about? What was the inspiration for Footprints in the first place?
Well, I'd worked in the police service for 20 years, and I'd worked in child protection, and I ended up having to take medical retirement for unrelated reasons to work. And my children had all attended a local private day nursery, and they'd stayed there for the early years education before they went to school. And it was due to close because the lady had 2 settings and she wanted to continue with one but close the other. And she asked me to take it on, and I was very apprehensive at first, never having done this sort of thing. But obviously I did do it. But when I did it, I wanted to put a different perspective, because some educational establishments are quite rigid and it doesn't really fit in with working parents. Yeah. And when you've got children that all have to be in different places and you have to be at work and you've very busy families, so I wanted to offer something that gave parents choice and flexibility. They could go to school nurseries and come here. We could offer transport. We could just deliver something that was pretty unique across the UK, really, not just to this area. Because I do believe that if you give parents what they want, that's the first tick in the box. And if you provide a quality service alongside that, then it's a win.
Absolutely. And over 10 years later, it has worked exceptionally well. But in those early days, and it was, as everyone knows, obviously founded in 2006 now, in those early days, what were the major challenges you were facing at the time, Sharon?
Similar to today, really. A lot of it is to do with affordability and finances. Childcare is one of the most expensive things that a family will have to pay for.
Yes.
Childcare and a mortgage. And when you live in an area like we do, which is high deprivation, poverty, and having policed this town, I knew the problems that came with it on a social, economic front. Being able to be affordable but still deliver the quality of service. And that's still an issue today because prices rise, wages rise, overheads rise, but you still have to be affordable.
Yes.
If we were somewhere different in the UK, we would be charging a different price, but the overheads are still the same for us. So it's about being a bit creative, about being the best you can with all of those constraints, really. And just making people believe in you as a business and as a childcare provider, because a parent's most important thing in their life is their child, and it has to be right.
Yes, there has to be such a strong element of trust is necessary.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. I know in terms of funding, we'll certainly come onto that, I think, in a little bit, because there's an awful lot to say about that.
Yes, there is.
And but I think one of the great things that you've achieved at Footprints is the fact that where others struggle, you have managed to have a fantastic rate of staff retention, and that is something that can be exceptionally challenging at any nursery. But with that, you're able to really build your own sort of little family with the children there. That's such a big help on a day-to-day basis.
Well, it is, and I've got staff here that the children they looked after in the early days, and they certainly looked after my children before I took on the nursery. Some of those staff are still here, and now they're looking after my grandchildren.
Oh,
so it is, I'm not the only family like that. And it's, I started with 12 staff. 8 of those staff are still with me, and we now have a team of 35. So I think we invest in our people. We can't afford to pay them very good wages. A lot of them are on minimum wage. But it's about giving them in other ways. If we can't give them in wages, we give them little perks otherwise. Like at various different times, I bring a therapist in so they can have little therapy sessions, head massages, foot massages throughout the day whilst they're at work. We take them on trips out. I took them to a cottage for the weekend just 2 weeks ago for Christmas. That was a bit of an expense, but that's a good expense the team can build together. They can have some fun together. When I can't afford to give them higher wages.
Of course.
So we budget for that. We budgeted for that throughout the year. So come Christmas, we were able to do those sorts of things. We do staff reward schemes. We have a good work-life balance. I promote that with the staff because we offer that to our parents, and our staff are no different to that. And it's about staff being and feeling valued. And I'm a strong believer in that. And if you look after your staff, then they'll stay.
It clearly shows, and it works. And you've touched on it already, in fact, Sharon, but you've pointed to the fact that a lot of nurseries can be a little too rigid for a lot of working parents. And yourselves, you offer everything from breakfast to late evenings and indeed weekends as well. Now, there are obviously huge benefits to that, but what are the in terms of the children themselves? What is the best approach in dealing with them? A lot of people do have some silly notion that sort of all children are the same and they can be treated, because they're just a child. But they are. People do forget they are, of course, individuals, aren't they?
Yeah, children are absolutely individuals. They're sponges. They're very receptive to everything that's going on around them. They have their own individual, unique personalities. And within that, you also have different abilities. You can have disability. You can have great ability. And if you can provide a service that can give each child what they need, it is difficult sometimes. And it can be quite testing for some of the staff on occasions, but by recognising children as individuals and being able to cater for those children by offering resources, by offering different methods, without being rigid and restrictive, being able to be free and not stick to conventional rules, but just let children develop and discover and explore. That makes a world of difference. And everybody learns at different times through different methods. Not everybody sits down and, you can't say at 9 o'clock, we're going to sit down and we're going to do this, and you have to sit and you have to listen. Schools are very rigid because they have to be. But nursery care and education and childcare generally doesn't have to be that prescriptive. I'm a firm believer in that. And if we have children up until they go to school, some are very ready, some are very ready at an early age, some aren't. And I would like to offer our service just a couple of years later for some children who will be more equipped to go into mainstream education at, say, 7 or 8, and staying with us and learning and adapting and just being in general all-around individuals in a way that school doesn't suit them. And I'm not a criticisms of schools, I'm not at all. But I just think there should be alternatives. And for some children, they don't have to have great disabilities to not fit into the school system. And not every child does fit into the school system. And we are living in 2020, not 1950. And it doesn't have to be that way.
That's interesting.
Some children thrive and some don't.
Absolutely. And I think I can imagine in the future, perhaps not too far away, Sharon, that the education system will change to adopt and adapt to a more individual basis.
I would hope so. I would really hope so. I mean, on the continent, certainly some children don't go to school till 6 or 7 or 8. Different countries have different ways of providing education, childcare. What concerns me at the moment is there's a drive for schools to take children at 2 years old. And I don't think necessarily that 2-year-old children should be at school. Why are they at school? Childcare, education can be delivered alternatively. And if they go to school, they can't go till 9 o'clock. They have to be picked up at 3 or half past 3 or whatever the school times are. It is very restrictive. That doesn't fit as a working parent. And a school is not necessarily the only way that a child is going to learn the things they need to learn at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. There are alternatives, but there's a huge drive for children to go to school at 2 now, and lots of funding is being put into schools to provide that service. I personally, that repels me a little, because I don't think all children should be in school at 2. I don't think any child should be in school at 2.
And I think, Sharon, you very much speak on behalf of, I'm not just the sector, but a great many parents as well. It is controversial and
very,
and time will tell, I'm afraid, in that case. But you've mentioned the F word, so we'll bring it up: funding. Sharon,
funding.
You'll know more than anyone in some of the really perilous state that a lot of nurseries, in the number that have closed over the last few years because of the issue. Just for the listeners, explain the difficulties and the challenges that the current funding situation is bringing to the sector.
Well, one of the biggest things is it's put out as free childcare. It is not free childcare, it is subsidised childcare. Parents believe it's free, so they expect everything that goes with it to be free. We are one of the few nurseries that don't charge a subsistence because of the area we live in, because of the poverty in our town. We're one of the 10 deprived towns in the UK at various times. Sometimes we drop in and out of the top 10. But there's a lot of socio-economic problems in this town, and for us to then charge a supplement to parents when other nurseries aren't doing that, we can't do it. So either all of the nurseries in our area do it or we don't. But parents are still under the illusion that it's free childcare. The level of funding we get does not cover the hourly rate. We have overheads. My staff are on minimum wage because I can't afford to pay them anymore. My overheads are wages of between 70 and 80% of our income. And we then, on the rest of our income, we have to pay rent, electricity, food, resources, and everything else that comes with running a nursery. And the hourly rate that we get doesn't cover the hourly rate. So the parents that actually pay end up inadvertently subsidising those parents that don't. But we offer meals, and meals aren't designed to be included in that funding childcare. But how can I say to a child, you can have a meal and you can't? I'm not going to do that.
Yeah,
and you can place that resource because we paid for that out of that pot, but you're not going to because you're a funded child. You cannot differentiate these children at all. So it comes to choice whether you either accept the funded children and you charge a subsidy, which we don't, or you don't accept them. Well, I can't afford not to accept them because a lot of our children, we've got a good reputation. We work with lots of different agencies. We're highly recommended. I'm not going to run my business by saying I'm not taking funded children. We're very, very inclusive. But I have to look at funding. I cannot afford. I don't know going into 2020 how we are going to afford it. I myself, I take a very small wage, and I'm going to have to cut that even further going into next year.
And I think wholeheartedly, obviously, we are speaking just after the general election. I think I've seen Neil Leach, the chief exec of the Early Years Alliance, expressed, I think, on behalf of every provider at how disappointing all of the promises were from the major parties in terms of driver, because they are, as you've really explained exceptionally well just there, Sharon, it's simply not realistic.
It isn't realistic. And what's put out to the parents, they believe that it is free childcare. Then they come to us and we say, well, actually, it's not quite free. They don't understand that. They're not interested in politics or funding. All they believe is what they've been told is that it's free childcare for their child. I don't want to turn any child away from here at all. But the reality is, the amount of nurseries in this town and the amount of schools that are now providing 2-year-old provision, nurseries will close in this town. I don't want it to be mine.
No.
But I don't know who it's going to be, and it's a reality. And I know Mr. Johnson is promising to put lots of money into the public services for the people. I wholeheartedly like that, but the reality is that going to happen?
Well, that's exactly the point. And I know, obviously, Sharon, you're speaking from the northeast, and there was really, I mean, it's fair to say, a bit of a political earthquake there. There are certain seats that you would not expect to now have Tory representation, and I think the great hope, because you talk about increased expenditure on public services, but this is I think it's fair to say, you might disagree here, Sharon, but I don't know, but this is quite a different Conservative Party because of the new representation of it, especially in the north and the northeast. It's not perhaps the Thatcherite economic party of the 80s, but a much more public services orientated one.
I would hope so, having worked in public services and in the Thatcher days as well. I would hope that this Conservative Party is different to that. Time will tell. He does talk a very good script, but I want him to deliver, and I hope he does. Well, Hartlepool has been a Labour town for very, very many years, and the exit poll suggested it might turn Conservative. People are genuinely fed up. They are really fed up, and they do that through their votes. Sedgefield, Tony Blair's, Trundon, Tony Blair's seat has turned Conservative, and these are people that would never ever dream of turning Conservative, ever. My own politics, well, I'll reserve judgment on what I say, but I would like Mr. Johnson to do what he promises to deliver. I believe in public services. I come from that background, and we're a country now where we have to invest in people. And we have to invest in the young because they are our future. And we can only do that by giving them the childcare that they need and deserve and desire.
I tell you what, Sharon, I'm going to put you on the spot. Let's say this afternoon you were made Secretary of State, and you had a magic wand, and you could pass any legislation through. What is it that any government could do, and what would you do that would aid in terms of legislation? Your business,
in terms
your
of
sector.
childcare?
Yes.
In our sector, I would abolish 2-year-olds going to school. If they want to set up children's centres, yes, let's look at that. Let's look at private nurseries. Let's deliver a wholly inclusive service that can fit everybody. It doesn't just fit one person or one size. One size doesn't fit all. Let's re-educate everything. People work different working patterns. Why do we have to have a nursery or a setting that opens at 8 o'clock and shuts at 6? What about those parents that work of an evening? Let's give the parents what they need. Let's become part of their family. Let's become the best childcare educators, the best, give them exploration, give them play, stop the curriculum, stop all of this testing of children. Test the nurseries, test the educators by all means, but not the children. Because the children will learn and develop and explore if you have the right provider. Invest in the providers. At the minute, all the providers are shutting because they've got no funding. Everybody's being pushed into schools. It's restrictive. The whole lot needs a huge reform.
Well, Mr. Johnson, there's your manifesto. Now,
yes, please. I would love to go to Parliament to speak to Mr. Johnson and his representatives and have a thought-out programme of, right, this is what we're going to do. Don't just say yes to parents who've got free funding. If you're going to give them free funding, make it properly free. Give the nursery providers and the schools or people who are providing it at the time, give them the proper amount of money so they can provide that.
Exactly.
And you know what? We have staff that go to college for 2 years to become a level 3 childcare provider, childcare nursery nurse, and they earn minimum wage. Mm. You can go and work in a supermarket without any qualifications and earn more than that.
You're exactly
the
right.
sector itself is not valued. As a childcare owner, you know, some people live in affluent areas and they do might make a fortune. If you're part of a chain, you might get better profits. I'm an individual running a business, something very passionately that I believe in, working for a pittance myself with responsibility of over 200 children and 35 staff, all on my head, all on my responsibility. I certainly don't do that for the money.
And I think, Sharon,
if I did it for the money, I wouldn't be doing it.
Yes, and I think that's something in this country that requires much more fundamental changes how we think as a nation in terms of what roles we value, and whether that's childcare or adult care, nursing. You know, it's something that as a general population, I think we need to reconsider. Sharon, we could talk about this all day. We shouldn't. I'm conscious of the time. I know you've got an exceptionally exciting, if unpredictable, perhaps 2020. What were some of those projects you'll be working on?
Well, we've recruited a new special educational needs consultant who's working with the staff on training and development, and we are looking to expand. We've done SEN playgroups. We're looking to expand to have children who have additional needs that would ordinarily might have to go to specialist schools or specialist nurseries, for which there's very little. We're looking to expand our provision to cater for these children, to integrate them into all of the things that we do ordinarily, and really put us on the map for that in this area. There isn't an early years childcare provider with that at the heart of its ethos at the moment, and I would like to be that person. They don't have to have a diagnosis of anything, just children that might struggle. They could have a diagnosis or they might not, but it could be children that just have some difficulties. Very often children aren't diagnosed with things preschool, but you can tell they may need some extra help and support in some ways. I want to give that. I don't want to exclude any child. And if they have to stay with us for a few years, a bit longer, to help them to be equipped further on, we're investing in them so they have the best chance in life, because I'm all about the people.
Spot on. And Sharon, it would be a pleasure if we could chat again in a few months to see exactly what promises are going on for the sector. But it's very important to follow up. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Sharon, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Footprints are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Lord Pickles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. But of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What was you? I mean, of course, you president there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. what would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there, it'll be all right?
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because, you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want. And I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well,
I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay to be members, and it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner-city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I will join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to us. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story, most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office, but who is it that you have?
I had Che Guevara, which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Blunkett was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastic new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was your proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and war-bane. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large, they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
That's very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country? Well,
I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, you know, it's like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to.
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it will be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it will be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Well, Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the feathers to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.